Hello, I'm Gina Fitt, and you've either purposely selected or surfed to Life Talk with Bern Moses. I'd like to invite you to eavesdrop on our conversation this evening. Bern, last week we were talking about commitment, and you mentioned to me the importance of making a lot of commitments in your life. And it occurred to me that maybe sometimes I make too many commitments, and I have trouble, and I'm frantically running around trying to keep on top of everything I have to do. And I wondered if there needs to be a common ground.
The thing that comes up in my mind when you say that, are you really making commitments, or are you making promises and making plans and setting yourself up? You know what I'm saying? In other words, what we were saying last week is to get into a process where you get super serious about making commitments. And the reason to do that is to enjoy and appreciate and to be able to celebrate a whole lot of completions. You see, completions create energy, and they do tend to empower us.
Yes.
I went to a seminar some years ago where they examined our histories pretty well, and most people there, including myself, gave evidence that there was a lot of incompletes in our life.
I feel that all the time.
I have a young man in my life who said that his family is filled with incompletes, rusty shovels sitting by partially dug pools, you know what I mean, all over the house. And I think there's an interesting parallel here, that people have to examine how they feel about death and dying, because there's some evidence that if there's a lot of incompletes in their life, they're anxious about that very subject. It's not until you embrace the concept of death and dying can you begin to make more and more completions. To be comfortable with the process of living, it's really kind of fascinating how that blends together that way. I think the main thing is, in making commitments, is to get serious in the beginning about getting into this process we talked about briefly, I think, last week, when we talked about that a commitment is something that you say you're going to do, or what, do you remember?
Or die.
Or die.
Yeah.
That's pretty serious. Now, if you're going to take it that seriously, then you're going to have to consider all the nuances of the event. For example, if I make a commitment, am I going to run out of time? What's going to occur that could impinge upon this? How might I have to make adjustments in it? And all those things have to come up in the consideration process. And so when you make a commitment in the beginning, they should be simple ones so that the subconscious mind gets conditioned to the process. Remember I said that if you make a little commitment, no matter how little it is, when you mean that this is what I'm going to do or die, that the rats and roaches will run around in your mind and body. Remember we talked about that?
Yes, and I think we've all had times when we felt that way.
Sure. And so when you make the commitment, then make it so that you know you can complete it, have the completion, let the mind go, oh, I can manage that, I can handle that, and then make another commitment. Let the rats and roaches run, and pretty soon you can extend those commitments. Now, in extending them and making them an integral part of your life and your planning process, to very quickly review, there are some things you really need to be aware of. And that is the consideration process. Remember we talked about consideration. What can come up that's going to get in the way? What good is going to happen if I make this commitment and complete it? What incomplete will there be, or what bad might come if I don't? Who's going to interfere with this? Whose lives are going to be impinged upon if I make this commitment? How our lives going to benefit? And there's all that process. Now in the beginning, little commitments, pretty easy to make. But then gradually as you extend out, well, then it gets more and more serious, and because of that there's more and more power that comes with it. In that commitment process, collaborating is part of that. Who can I bring into this with me? Who's going to be affected by it? See, the collaboration. Coordinating. Who can I bring into this process with me to support me? What information can I get that'll help me complete it? All those things. Oh, and then of course remember the compartmentalizing. Can this commitment be broken down into little mini commitments? Mini commitments that can be completions in themselves and can allow me to go on in another direction if I need to. I mean, all those things come into play. It can be pretty serious business, and we've had no coaching, no training on it as a society as a whole. And that's kind of tragic.
It is, and I think maybe it starts as small as like my son, who's 6 years old, committing to brush his teeth every morning. Don't you think sometimes little things like that, getting in a habit of doing something very simple,
and it becomes habitual? You betcha.
Right.
It'd be good for him. We know this, that if you can develop an internal reputation, what I mean by internal is that when you make a commitment, somehow you just know you're going to complete it. And when that begins to transmit itself into your friends and peers, family, siblings, and what have you, after a while, the magical part of it is that people stand aside and leave you alone. You know how things come up?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's just amazing. There were several people, for example, that were going to be here in the studio with us this evening, and they're not here. Something came up.
Something came up.
And they rationalize and justify that. But can you imagine us not being here? I mean, that would be ludicrous, wouldn't it?
We would be here.
Yeah.
Regardless.
So you make the commitment and
Right.
you come. If you're ill, if someone else is ill, if something else comes up, hey, that's okay. I do know this, and people can test this. There's something powerful about the word commitment. For example, if I have a commitment to spend the evening with my children, I don't need to tell the world what that's about. But if someone calls me and says, hey, Bern, we're all going out for pizza, why don't you come along? If I said, well, I had another plan, I was going to spend some time with my kids, oftentimes they'll prevail upon me to violate that and say, well, you can do that later, or you can do it tomorrow, the kids will understand. You know, they'll try to persuade you. Or if they say, well, I promised my wife that I would do this or that, or I kind of planned on doing this or that, they will try to get into your act. If you say, however, gee, sounds great, probably more fun than what I'm going to do, but I've made a commitment for the evening, people tend to back away. Somehow, there's a power in the word. It's just something, it's a great thing. Now, the only thing of it is, though, you've got to get the reputation of completing them.
Well, there's a great deal, I believe, confidence and respect and trust that comes with people who do what they say they're going to do.
Isn't there?
And there is responsibility that comes with that.
Exactly.
People rely on them and depend on them. I think a lot of times we have, what did you say, planning? What's the difference between planning to or committing to?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes our heart isn't in it. And so we, at the last minute, back out.
I think sometimes these things are accommodations, too. People want us to do something, so we say we will. It's kind of like I've found, for example, in sales, that I'll make an appointment with someone. Well, that's what happened. I made the appointment. They didn't.
You committed.
Yeah, I committed. They didn't. I go. They're not there. And I feel like I've been stood up. I've learned not to feel that way. And that's what I will do when I make the appointment now. I'll do little things like saying, now look, I'm a professional. I've committed to the time. I will be there, and I will be on time. And then if they say, well, so will I, then you're getting real close to a commitment. See what I'm saying? In other words, and so you let them know how you're going to play the game, and then they're on their own. However, I also find that because of my understanding about commitment, that I'm very patient with people. That indeed, if they're not there, I don't feel they stood me up. I wasn't even part of the process.
Right.
Now, something else came up. Since they don't live in commitment, they scooted along and they abandoned me. Or not really, but you know what I'm saying? And so I'll usually call and give them an excuse.
That was an interesting phrase you just said, live in commitment. Now, I haven't heard it put that way before. Can you tell me why you happen to use that phrase?
Oh, gee, if you can get to a point where if you're that way, people flat leave you alone. In other words, if you're committed to doing more than you need to do in order to get a job done, people will not interfere with you. It's kind of like if you're a committed person and you carry that persona about you, it's like if you go to a parade and you're in the 5th row. I love a parade. You know? And I'm in the 5th row. If I want to be in the 1st row, I can be in the 1st row. All I got to do is make a commitment. You know, and to be patient with it, and to nudge, and to excuse myself, and to press forward, to retreat, change directions. But there's no question in my mind that I can get to the 1st row unless I run into someone or some number of people in front of me who are more committed than I am to be on the 1st row. But you know what? I've never found it. I've never found that.
That's amazing.
People don't live that way. And so, now the one thing of it is, it takes a lot of practice. You got to practice it, and you're going to, have shortcomings from time to time. But I know one thing that comes out of it. A strength of living, an enhancement of life, an enrichment of your present and your future. There's no question. I can give you some illustrations. For example, in 1979, I was pursued by a company in Kansas City, Missouri to get into the funeral business. Not as a funeral director or mortician, but to sell pre-arrangement, which I have come to believe is a very valid thing a person should do. And I was not interested. I said, no, no, no. I've been into entertainment, dining, and travel business, and I was not interested. So they called me again and again, and I said no. They invited me to come to their home office in Kansas City, and I said, I'd be glad to come, but I'm not going to make a commitment. They said, okay, come on up. I went up. They treated me royally. I came home, no commitment. The time came when they called and said, look, if you take that office in Dallas, we'll give you a Cadillac. That caught my attention. I'd never been a bonus baby before. And so I called them back and I said, okay, I'll commit 1 year. And they said, well, we were hoping for more than that. And I said, well, there may be more than that, but I will commit for a year. And what that means is that no matter how difficult, no matter how boring, no matter how overwhelming or how challenging, I'll throw my heart and my soul into this for 1 year. So they contented themselves with that. Let me tell you, a few days later, we went into the office to set up our books and what have you, and I realized we hadn't done something very important. We hadn't visited the funeral home that we were going to be representing with the trust program. And so I called over, made an appointment. They were delighted to hear from us. We drove over, and they received us comfortably and well. Took us on a tour. Now, we saw the chapel, seated 250 people, stained glass windows, the only pipe organ in the funeral chapel in the state of Texas, and they were proud of that, and had a right to be. Took us around the back, showed us the preparation room, didn't spend a whole lot of time there. Came up, spent some time in the reposing room because we all looked pretty good. And we came out back to the lobby, and I thought, well, you know, it's over, but it wasn't. They said, we're especially proud of our selection room. And we walked in, and what that was, Gina, was a whole room full of caskets, okay, arranged in a merchandising kind of a way, which is not inappropriate. I walked in, there was about 1, 2, 3.5 seconds, and I collapsed. A wail came out of me, I began to convulse, I got nauseous, my knees buckled, something was wrong. They escorted me out hurriedly, and they said, what's wrong? I said, I don't know, I have no idea. I knew it was with me, though, because my cohorts, the people that had gone with me, didn't react that way.
Right.
That evening I had a nightmare about death and dying. The next 2 or 3, 4 nights I had nightmares about my children, my spouse, myself.
Oh,
I was really having difficulty. And if I hadn't made a commitment, it would have been awful easy to call and say, look, I'm right, this is not my cup of tea. But I'd made a commitment, okay? And so I continued. I went on through it. I began to examine, to wonder what this was all about. And out of that came some life-enhancing, life-enriching experiences, no question, that I would not have enjoyed, that I would not have benefited from if I hadn't made the commitment. You understand what I'm saying?
So you're willing to make a commitment in the face of your fear?
Yes.
And
I'd made the 1 year, I'd practiced it, and I was going to do that no matter what, and it was one of the most fruitful years of my entire life. Now, at the same time, and by the way, we'll talk about that in future evenings with our audiences, because there's some real information that came out of that experience that really expanded my whole life and has afforded me the chance to expand the lives of others about this one subject. Another time, I had committed to a bookkeeping company. They were selling bookkeeping services to small to middle-sized businesses, and I was to go in and, as a consultant, determine some new pay plans and techniques and what have you. Toughest thing I've ever done in my life. I mean, I'm not going to explain why tonight because that'll come up in the future, but it was tough. And about midway through the year, I knew, boy, this was going to be 1 year and that was it. You know what I'm saying? About halfway through the year, I got a phone call, to make a long story short, offering me one of the finest deals you could imagine. $100,000 a year, access to a Learjet, vice president in charge of marketing of a company that was in the travel business, which had been some of my background. And I actually heard myself saying, I hope this is available in January, and here it was July or August. I hope this is available in January because what? Right now,
you actually were able to pass up such a wonderful opportunity because of a commitment.
Exactly. Now, it was the only time my family questioned my intellect about commitments. They thought, I mean, enough is enough. And I said, no, this is the right thing to do. And I completed the year, and probably it worked out okay because the company didn't make it. Not because I didn't go with them, I'm sure. You know what I mean? In other words, it probably wasn't as good as they made it sound.
The offer that you had, I see.
But at the end of the year, I was stronger, more prepared, more equipped than I otherwise would have been if I'd have violated my own commitment. Follow what I'm saying?
Yes, I
do. Can you imagine how much less stress, how much more happiness, peace of mind could exist in our relationships if people had prepared themselves to understand how and why to make commitments? Commitments free us up. Commitments empower us. They do not entrap us. And if we can understand that, my gosh, it's incredible the difference that could come out of it.
I find that a lot of times in my life I'm the most frustrated when I'm indecisive.
Yes.
And I had a friend tell me once, if you don't make the decision, someone else will make it for you if you wait long enough. And avenues will no longer be open to you that were. And I found that to be true a lot of times with regret for not committing when I had the opportunity.
Exactly.
Now this is commitment, obviously, is something that's been discussed throughout time, and there's a lot of philosophizers who've had things to say about commitment. And how does that tie in with your ideals of...
I knew we were going to talk about commitment this evening, and I wanted to bring along one of the more famous comments about commitments that the German philosopher Goethe actually made. It's a delightful piece, and I'm going to take the liberty of reading it, which is kind of inappropriate, but I want to do this. It's the begin it now piece. Begin it now. Until one is committed, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness, and that's true. Concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans, that the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. Now we're going to have to examine this in a moment. All sort of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. I have to be careful of that. A whole stream of events issues from the decision raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents and meetings and material assistance which no man could have dreamed would have come his way. Whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Begin it now. Beautiful.
That is wonderful.
However, we have to be careful. When you call upon providence to move, in other words, I do not believe, I do not accept the fact that if you or I make a commitment that the forces of nature and circumstance begin to align themselves in favor of us. In other words, what really happens, Gina, is that when you make a commitment, you become focused. You become on purpose. All right? And whenever that occurs, there's an energy and a stamina and a creativity and an awareness that comes that otherwise would not exist. And you will see things. You will appreciate things that you otherwise would have missed. For example, I have an illustration that I use about a little boy living along a railroad track, and nice kid, and he's seen on television about the environment and picking things up and what have you. So he goes to his daddy and says, "Daddy, I'd like to take a trash bag and go along the railroad track and pick up the bottles and the cans and the snap tops and one thing and another. Would that be okay?" And his dad says, "Good idea. As a matter of fact, when you're through, we can take the bottles and the cans and we can go and trade them in and get some money for you." Well, see, that is a consequence, a socio-economic consequence of making a commitment and being on purpose. And that's pretty common. There's another thing that can occur, though, and often does when we make commitments, and that's called serendipity. It's a fringe benefit, unforeseen. For example, little boy's going along picking up the trash, and he's focused. He's being detailed about it, and he'll find the diamond ring. The diamond was always there. Notice it didn't get there because he made the commitment. It was always there, but now, because he's focused and his attention level is right, he sees the diamond. And this is something that most people never benefit from in their life, is the serendipitous responses that come from making commitments. Terribly, terribly important. It's comparable, for example, in history. When President Kennedy stood in front of the nation and the world and said it's time for America to commit to go to the moon and bring a man, send a man to the moon and bring him home safely. They didn't have the technology, they didn't know how they were going to do it, but he made a commitment, all right? People began to think, to move in that direction. The creativity levels were heightened, and they found the technology, and it was only 9 short years later, when this huge silver needle, ready to write history in the heavens, with 3 men sitting up in the point, and there was the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and the earth shook for 9 miles out. 9 miles of vibration.
I still get shivers when I think about that.
It's incredible.
What an incredible accomplishment.
And it didn't even move. The rocket just settled there. And they burnt more fuel on the pad than the whole rest of the journey. Okay? Nothing moved. It takes that sometimes. And I remember so clearly the umbilical cord cutting away and floating away in the heat. And then the gantries moved aside and it began to move. And a voice in the background that I captured on tape, and it was burnt in a fire, and I wish I had it to play for you because talk about goosebumps. The voice in the background said, "The Eagle is committed to space travel. It will not return to the launching pad." You think about it. I mean, that's goosebumply.
Yes.
Yeah. Once you make commitments, you never go back. You never go back to where you were before. And every commitment, okay, and therefore completion, gives you more power, more authority, more esteem, and a recapturing of initiative that can make a difference in anyone's life.
I have another question along the lines of commitment. It seems like sometimes when we make a commitment, not the opposite happens of what Goethe says here. Instead of the way opening up for us, it seems like all sorts of struggles come to keep us from our purpose. Now, would you say that's just the other side of the coin? Maybe those were all things that were already there in the environment, but because we weren't committed, they weren't
they're there,
obstacles that we were encountering because we hadn't started on our journey yet, so to speak?
If you set off on a course without commitment or the reputation for having a completion, or developing a reputation for completions, you have to understand that everybody in our life wants to write on our board. And no, that's just natural. For example, this is a plain white sheet, Gina, and you can take this pen and write anything you want, so long as it's within the law. I'm talking about cause and effect, gravity, you know, equal and opposite reaction.
Right.
You can write anything you want to for your future on that pad, but you've got to be aware that everybody's trying to get the pen away from you. They'll say, no, Gina, you shouldn't be doing that. This is what you should do. You're crazy. There's no way you're ever going to do that. This is probably what you should do. So you got to keep a firm grip. Now, after a while, they won't do that. Notice if you write the commitment and complete it, write a commitment and complete it, pretty soon they don't try to grab your pen. And then you get focused and your life starts moving forward. I can't remember the last time something came up. I do remember. Commitment is kind of going beyond. I remember when I joined the Navy years and years ago, everyone told me before I went in there was something I should never do, and that was volunteer for anything. I mean, you don't volunteer. And I figured, gee, that doesn't make any sense. That's not in keeping with strategizing that we talked about a couple weeks ago. So when I went in, I didn't wait for them to ask. I looked for things that needed to be taken care of, things to do, contributions that could be made. And I'll tell you, I spent 10 years as an enlisted person, never stood a watch, never stood an inspection, no one ever hassled me. You see, if you make commitments and complete them, doing a little bit more than you're normally expected to do, people will flat leave you alone because they're afraid you'll what? Afraid you'll stop. Yeah,
well, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Don't bother him.
Yeah, he's doing something.
Don't bother him. Just leave him alone. There's so much that can be said about this one subject, and never enough.
Well, Bernie, in the few minutes that we have left, I was wondering if you'd like to give people an opportunity to call or write into our show, and if you have a number that they can reach us at.
Well, there's two things they can do. One is they can call, okay, I'm going to put this, 1-800-661-3490. Okay, that's 1-800-661-3490. And ask for one of two things. Either an audio of this show, which we'd be happy to send out to them, or your notes.
Great.
In other words, if you want Gina's notes, you just call in and she'll send them to you. And if you want the audio, we'll send you that too. But once again, it's 1-800-661-3490. And I'd especially appreciate notes and cards and letters with challenges, questions, critiques of what we're saying and doing. By the way, if you want to do that, you can send it to, I believe it's 1371 Howe Avenue. It's probably wrong. 1731. 1731. See, when you make a mistake, they really get the correction. 1731 Howe Avenue, suite number 321. And that's in Sacramento. I'm going to take a liberty here, Sacto. 95825. But a letter or a card or a comment will really be appreciated, and we'll address any issue that people want to bring up.
And since our show this evening is about commitment, I'd like to make a challenge to you all. So if you, as a result of this show, make a commitment that you would like to write and tell us about, we'd love to get your copy. We'd love to have you send that to us.
Okay.
Great.
I think it's probably pretty close to wrap-up time here, and I'm going to say thank you here. My little thank you note to the world. And sign it Byrne. And
Moses.
the last name is?
Thank you, Byrne.
Thank you. We'll talk to you later.